3.5 weeks ago, Clint Kubiak stood in front of reporters and settled this quarterback competition in a single sentence. Last night, he unsettled it again in about half that many words. That's the story I actually want to talk through today, not the final score from Houston, even though the final score was genuinely fun to watch unfold. Quick recap on the game itself, before I get into what actually matters here. Fernando Mendoza opened this one under center for the first half. Aidan O'Connell closed it out and played the entire second half. Kirk Cousins never touched the field, and most of this roster's real starters stayed on the sideline the whole night. The defense settled in and made real plays once the second half started. And on offense, O'Connell drove this team 96 yards in a genuine clutch situation to seal a comeback win. All of that is worth discussing on its own terms, but it's what Kubiak said afterward that I genuinely cannot stop thinking about this morning. He got asked point blank whether Cousins is locked in as the Week 1 starter, and he wouldn't commit to it. He said there's still another week of football left, that he doesn't want anyone getting comfortable in their job. I want you to actually sit with that phrasing for a second, because it's a real departure from where this whole competition supposedly stood a few weeks ago. Back on July 28th, right as training camp opened, Kubiak stood in front of these same reporters and said Cousins was his starting quarterback, full stop, that he'd earned it because of how well he'd played. That was about 3.5 weeks ago. Now, coming off a night where his backups outplayed expectations, he's suddenly not ready to reaffirm that same commitment out loud. I don't think that's nothing. I think that's a real shift, even if it turns out to be a small one in the grand scheme of the season. What makes this even more interesting is something else Kubiak mentioned in that same session, that the staff has actually been discussing the possibility of carrying 3 quarterbacks on the 53-man roster instead of the usual 2. That's not standard practice around this league. Teams carry 3 quarterbacks when they genuinely believe all 3 bring something worth protecting, whether that's pure insurance, developmental value, or in this specific case, maybe both things at once. It makes you wonder whether this conversation is being driven at least partly by what Aidan O'Connell showed on tape last night. And that's exactly where I want to dig in before we even get to Mendoza. I want to say this clearly up front. If you're surprised O'Connell can throw the ball like this, you simply haven't been paying close attention to his career up to this point. Line up 100 quarterbacks across this league right now, and his ball placement, his velocity, his overall accuracy puts him in the conversation for the top 10. He didn't make it to the NFL because of his legs or his athletic profile. He made it because he can process a defense and because he can genuinely spin the football. That's exactly the trait profile Kubiak tends to value in a quarterback, and O'Connell has spent most of his time in this building buried as the 3rd option on a depth chart. But watching him operate last night inside a real offensive structure designed by a coach who actually knows how to scheme space and stress a defense made me wonder whether something in Kubiak's own evaluation genuinely shifted over these last couple of weeks. There's a broader point buried in here about how much a quarterback's perceived ceiling gets shaped entirely by the infrastructure surrounding him. O'Connell has bounced through multiple coordinators and multiple offensive identities since he arrived in this league, and quarterbacks who never get consistent scheme continuity rarely get a fair shot at proving what they're actually capable of. Now, for maybe the first time in his career, he's working inside a system built by a coach whose entire reputation is rooted in spacing concepts and stressing a defense both horizontally and vertically at once. When you finally hand a talented passer real answers built into the play design, instead of asking him to create something out of chaos on his own, this is exactly the kind of tape you tend to get back. Let's actually walk through a few of these throws, because the tape backs up everything I just said about him. There was a dig route to Malik Benson where O'Connell delivered the ball with essentially perfect timing, releasing it before Benson had even fully broken out of his cut. Watch the linebacker on that specific rep. There's a genuinely tight throwing window between 2 defenders, and O'Connell has a rusher bearing down on him at the exact same time. He anticipates the route, delivers into the only window that actually exists, and gets the ball out before contact ever arrives. Benson didn't come down with it, but that has nothing to do with the quality of the throw itself. That's advanced anticipation under real pressure, full stop. Then there's a 2nd and 16 conversion that picked up 17 yards. And honestly, I love this one more than the drop, because it shows real process underneath the result. O'Connell looks left first, clearly considers throwing that direction, doesn't like what he sees, and instead of forcing it anyway, resets and works to his second read. He finds the matchup against the linebacker and delivers an accurate ball right on time. That's a veteran trait, working through a full progression under duress instead of locking onto the first look and hoping it works out. A lot of backup quarterbacks in this league never actually develop that habit. O'Connell clearly has it already. There's another rep on 2nd, and one where the anticipation gets even more obvious. He's targeting a receiver working up the field, and the ball is already out of his hand before that receiver has even broken to the outside. That's not a read made after the fact. That's a decision made before the route has even fully declared itself, trusting the design and the leverage to be there once the ball actually arrives. It hit for 16 yards. A different 2nd and 1 look later in the same drive picked up 20 more. 2 big gains on the exact same down and distance inside one drive, both built on that same anticipatory trigger. I understand the caveat here, and I want to name it honestly, rather than pretend it doesn't exist. A good chunk of this came against Houston's 3rd and 4th string defensive personnel. The receivers catching these passes are mostly fighting for roster spots themselves, not established names. Context matters, and I'm not pretending this happened against a unit full of household names. But arm talent and anticipation either show up on tape or they don't, regardless of who's lined up across from you. And what O'Connell put on film last night is exactly what people who followed his career closely have been saying about him for years now. He simply never had a real system built around him before this staff arrived. That's actually the piece of this whole storyline I find most compelling. Quarterbacks are valuable, scarce assets across this entire league, and once a passer starts flashing real traits inside a real structure, other teams take notice fast. This organization gave up multiple first-round picks once for Carson Palmer, a solid quarterback but never someone considered elite. I'm not saying O'Connell commands that kind of return, but if simply keeping him around and letting him keep developing eventually nets even a mid-round pick as a worst-case outcome down the line, that's real value sitting on this roster that shouldn't get thrown away for nothing in return. Think about the asymmetry in that specific trade-off. The downside of keeping O'Connell around another year is essentially one roster spot, a spot this staff is apparently already discussing extending to 3 quarterbacks anyway. The upside is either genuine competitive insurance behind 2 other unresolved situations, or a real trade chip if another quarterback-needy team watches this exact tape and decides they want in. Teams have surrendered significant draft capital for far less proven backup production than what O'Connell has now shown across multiple seasons of work. Now let's turn to Mendoza, because he took real criticism after last week's pick 6, and I think a chunk of that criticism missed what actually happened on his tape from this specific game. His first pass of the night went 22 yards to Jalen Nailor, and the placement on that one deserves real credit. There was really only one throwing window available given the leverage of the defender, and Mendoza put the ball exactly there, forcing Nailor into a genuinely difficult adjustment that he made look easy. That's not an accident. That's a quarterback seeing the field correctly and trusting his arm to execute the only viable version of that specific throw. He did throw another interception in this game, and I want to be fair about what actually happened, rather than just citing the raw box score. From what Mendoza said afterward, reading between the lines a little, it sounds like he was expecting his running back to stay in and help with protection rather than release out into the flat. Instead, the back released early. Mendoza was already committing to that option under pressure, and the read simply didn't match what actually happened in front of him. That's a rookie miscommunication, not necessarily a bad decision in isolation. It happens, especially with young skill players still learning exactly when to sit and when to release. There were other rough moments tied far more to protection than to anything Mendoza did wrong personally. On one snap, he took a real shot after his tackle got beaten badly by a defensive end, working an inside move, and Mendoza still delivered the ball while absorbing contact, even though his primary read looked like it would have been open on that same play. On a different rep, A nicely designed Texans blitz got home almost completely clean, with a tight end essentially disguised as a slot corner before releasing into the rush. Nobody on the offense seemed to account for him, and Mendoza took a significant hit as a result. The very next snap, 2nd and 1 from inside the 28, protection broke down again. An interior defender slipped through untouched because of what looked like a communication error between the center and the guard, and Mendoza went down for a sack in a spot that should have been a completely manageable down and distance. None of that traces back to his decision-making at all. That's protection continuity, the exact issue that's followed this offensive line around all preseason long. There were still real positives mixed into the rest of that half. Plenty of them, actually. A nicely designed smash concept found Malik Benson for 18 yards. An accurate enough throw even if it wasn't placed perfectly, with Benson doing real work to go up and secure it. A different rep saw Mendoza attack a receiver with a well-designed whip route specifically built to exploit a defender clearly sitting on an inside breaking route. The read was excellent, recognizing exactly where the leverage advantage lived before the snap and calling the correct answer to it. The throw came out under a bit of pressure and landed a touch off target, and the target, unfortunately, dropped the pass regardless. On a deeper shot later in that same drive, Mendoza correctly read a cover 6 shell, understood that a receiver crossing the field would pull the safety with him, and threw the post route that opened up as a direct result of that read. The corner made a genuinely excellent individual play to close that window down late, but the process behind the entire concept, recognizing the coverage rotation and calling the right answer to it, was sound from start to finish. His final target of the half, another shot to Benson on 3rd and 6, also went uncaught. A drop that would have easily moved the chains and possibly set up points right before halftime. Add it all up, and you get a rookie who had roughly 4 different throws in this game alone, placed well enough to be completions, and simply weren't finished on the other end, mixed in with real protection issues that had nothing to do with his reads whatsoever. That's a very different story than the one a raw completion percentage or an interception total tells you on its own. So back to the actual question hanging over all of this. Why wasn't Kubiak willing to simply reaffirm Cousins after the game the way he did 3.5 weeks ago at the start of camp? My honest read is that this isn't really about Mendoza. I don't think this coaching staff believes he's ready to start regular season football right now, even with the real flashes he's shown, and I don't think it would be the smart move to throw him into that environment this early in his development. I think the more interesting question is whether O'Connell's performance specifically nudged something in how this staff is currently thinking about the roster, at least in the short term. Whether that ultimately changes anything about who starts in Week 1, I genuinely doubt it. I still expect Cousins to be the starter walking into that opener against Miami. But the fact that this coaching staff isn't willing to simply restate that commitment publicly right now, and the fact that keeping 3 quarterbacks on the roster is even part of an active internal conversation, tells you the level of certainty around this quarterback room isn't quite what it looked like heading into camp a few weeks back. Here's how I think the rest of this actually plays out. Mendoza is this organization's long-term answer at the position, and if you want him genuinely ready for that future, you have to let him take some real lumps now, in a low-stakes environment, rather than protecting him from every mistake along the way. That process has 1 more preseason week left before it effectively pauses for the year. Once the regular season begins, I don't expect Mendoza to see the field again this season, barring an injury to whoever's starting. Even if this team is sitting around 500 with a playoff picture still technically alive come December. Teams don't bench a functioning veteran in that spot to develop a rookie mid-season, no matter how much long-term upside that rookie carries. As for O'Connell, my honest expectation is still that his path here runs out once his contract does, and that he ends up finishing his career somewhere else next offseason. But last night was a real reminder of exactly why that outcome isn't as obvious or as settled as it looked a few weeks ago. And I think that uncertainty, more than anything else, is exactly what Kubiak was getting at when he refused to hand Cousins that job back publicly last night in front of everyone. I'll leave you with this. Preseason football rarely reshapes an actual quarterback competition on its own, And I want to be careful not to overstate what one strong half against reserve-heavy Texans personnel really proves about O'Connell's long-term outlook here. But competitions like this one aren't decided purely by who the front office assumed the answer was back in July. They're shaped, at least a little, by what actually shows up on tape once the games start counting for something, however small the stakes technically are. Kubiak watching his backup quarterback operate his offense with real anticipation and real command in the exact system this staff is trying to install from scratch is the kind of thing that lingers in a coach's mind, even if it never becomes the headline decision publicly. Whether that translates into anything come September, we'll find out soon enough. But for one night in Houston, Aidan O'Connell made this decision a lot less simple than it looked a few weeks ago.